Okay, well, good morning, class. I am excited to spend a little bit of time talking with you about our assignments for EDUC 6915, Exemplary Teaching in the 21st Century. So this is my second go around with this course. It's a new course in our graduate program. And so I'm trying to use lessons learned amongst myself and the scholars from the first term to see if I can better support scholars in this group. And I'm going to be looking for your feedback as well and your insights and comments as we go through this course and try to make it as effective and meaningful for each of you as possible. Okay, so the idea for our final project and plan is to be able to create some product that is a representation of your best effort at engaging, analyzing, and applying the concepts from this course. Okay, so think about Bloom's taxonomy and those higher order thinking skills. In your final project is supposed to represent and showcase your knowledge, skills, abilities, and dispositions that you are able to successfully use this material and apply it to teaching and learning. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is to share my screen for a moment here. And okay, and the screen that I want to share is my Canvas page. So let me see if I can get that up for you. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to walk you through the sections of our final project slash plan. And the reason that I say final project slash plan is because my hope is for you to be able to use this product that you use as a culminating demonstration of your learning as something useful, not solely something that you jumped through a hoop and you said, I met the objectives for EDUC 6915, but something that goes beyond that and is useful for you in your own classroom. Now, keep in mind that our course is called Exemplary Teaching or Master Teaching in the 21st Century. Okay. And I tend to shy away from that term master. I'm somebody who has spent a great deal of time looking into narratives and discourses. And I look at how language constructs the world around us rather than simply describes it. So, for example, if I were to call you a lazy thug, I wouldn't be describing you. You know that you are not a lazy thug, but I am constructing you as a lazy thug. And since I'm the one who gives grades and submits final grades for this course, I am the one who's in a higher power position in relation to you. You are a scholar educator, but you're also taking a graduate course and positioned as student. So you're in the more vulnerable position, and I'm in the one that I have more access to the institutional authority and power. And so I have more capacity to do harm to you if I am not diligent of making sure that I'm putting your best interests at the center of my teaching and my way of engaging with you as a group and as individuals. It's my job to make sure that I am constantly interacting with you as an I, thou, that you are so invaluable, such a, endlessly important and talented and intelligent human being that you are a thou, to be respected, loved, cared for, rather than an I, it relationship. If I treat you as an it. I'm treating you as an object, as if you have less value, that you are more dehumanized. And sometimes that happens when teachers talk about their students. They might say, these kids just don't know anything. And of course, that's not possible because human beings, we're geared to learn. We start learning even before we're born. When our mothers carry us in their womb, we're already hearing things, sensing things like light, and we can hear things later, such as music. And so we're already learning. And so it is not possible even to get to kindergarten or pre-K and not know anything. What teachers are generally saying when they say that is that the children do not know what I value and what I know and what I think is the important thing to know. They know something, it just doesn't match mine. So if I am dehumanizing them and treating them as if our classroom is a holding pen or a prison cell or something like that, I am treating other human beings as if they are objects to be handled rather than I, thou. And I didn't make that up. I wish. That actually comes from Martin Buber's work. And it was very famous for talking about pedagogy as an I, thou, and I, it relationship. And sometimes we slip into I, it, even in a conversation, and we can pull ourselves up. Like I might say to you all as scholar educators, give me feedback on my syllabus, give me feedback on my teaching. But then when you actually do, I feel defensive and maybe vulnerable, and I'm feeling hurt by some of your critiques. So I might feel the need to draw on the institutional power and say, well, that's not right. You're so rude, or, and minimize your contributions, or dismiss them, or ignore them. There's all kinds of things that I can do without, by kind of protecting myself without engaging what I have actually asked you to share. So that could happen in the same conversation, because I'm the person who has more control over the situation with the institutional backing as the professor and lead instructor in this course. Now, when you are in your classrooms, you become the one with the more institutional power, and your students are the more vulnerable ones. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I don't use the word master because of those historical traditions of language being used to construct the world, and master implies a significant imbalance of power. So the research is actually called exemplary teaching, or successful teaching and learning. And what this means is that it is exemplary because these are teaching approaches that teachers have developed over time across generations, where they have been successful with the learners that other teachers continue to fail with. And so that's exemplary. It's something different than the traditional trend of mediocre, basic, or completely failing with students. Exemplary is being successful with learners, fostering educational equity, successful learning outcomes, opportunities, experiences for learners, especially the learners that have been minoritized, excluded, and otherwise harmed and experienced trauma in schools and at the hands of teachers, not because teachers are bad people in general, but often because they don't realize how they may be uh, coercing learners to learn something that is from the teacher's perspective, but is actually very harmful to learners. They may not know that they are perhaps calling on boys more than girls, for example, steering boys more toward science, math, and STEM, rather than girls. And we know that this does happen because it's been well documented. So it's not that people do it on purpose, it's just that it often happens. And so exemplary teachers are teachers who are successful with these learners that other teachers tend to continue to fail with. In the 21st century, we're going to talk about that. What makes the 21st century different than, say, teaching in the 20th century or the 19th century, and so on. So everything that we do and everything that we read is all geared at us engaging this idea of what is exemplary teaching in the 21st century. Okay. And then, so this product or culminating activity, your portfolio that you show that you know and understand and can use the concepts from this course, your final project or slash plan, it should be useful to you in the sense that you are able to look at your own teaching approach and you're able to help maybe your colleagues and others around you look at their teaching approach. And you're not only able to identify and justify your evaluation of your own teaching approach and others' teaching approaches, but you're able to say with evidence, this is exemplary teaching because, and you didn't just pull that out of your head, you actually have evidence for that and it's backed up by research. And then you're making a plan for using your evaluation of your teaching practice, or maybe you're giving feedback to a colleague or a friend and taking next steps. How do I get my teaching to be closer to these ideals of exemplary teaching in the 21st century? None of us come into education. I have yet, in 30 years of being an educator, I have yet to meet a teacher who joins our profession because they want to be a dream wrecker. Most teachers want to be a dream keeper. And I'm using the term dream keeper from Langston Hughes. He's a Renaissance writer and poet from Brooklyn, New York. And he wrote a poem called Dreamkeeper. And he talks about how dreams should be held in blue cloud cloths, wrapped in blue cloud cloths. So they're very gently held. And as teachers, we can quickly smash or break our students' dreams, and even when we don't intend to. But most of us do not go into education because that's what we want to do. Most teachers, and this is documented by research, most teachers come into education because they love learning, they've been successful learners themselves. They want to share that love of learning. And often teachers will say that they want to give back, they want to serve others, that they love children, learners, adolescents. So teachers know that they don't go into education because they're going to get wealthy. Most teachers are aware that teaching is undervalued, under-resourced, overworked, and certainly underpaid. So they do it for altruistic reasons, and that's amazing. And I'm so glad that you are a teacher. So that's kind of where we're going. We want to explore what is exemplary teaching. How do we know when we're seeing it or not seeing it? And then what makes exemplary teaching in the 21st century different than, say, exemplary teaching in the 20th century or the 19th century? Okay. So that's where we're headed. That's kind of the path down the road that I want you to see so that you have kind of your framework in your head. And as we go through each module, you're able to say, how does this reading or how does this activity or this video, how does it contribute to my understanding and ability to apply and act on my understanding of exemplary teaching in the 21st century? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the section 1, introduction and context of our final paper project slash plan. Okay, so our first section of our final project is going to be focused on a little bit of what I've already talked about. What is exemplary teaching? How do we know when we're seeing exemplary teaching? Because exemplary teaching is not just based on opinions. It's actually empirically based. It's grounded in research and evidence. So you have to use data to show that it is exemplary. It's not just your opinion. Like you think that maybe Mrs. Brown has a really nice unit on the planets, and you think that's fun, so you think that that must be exemplary. That is not what we're talking about with exemplary. There's particular principles that have to be manifested and evidenced in the teaching and learning approach to be defined as exemplary. And again, exemplary is when the teacher is successful with learners that have historically been underserved and other teachers continue to fail with that individual or that group. Okay, so let's take a little look at what your first draft should look like. I put a note here. Remember that drafts do not have to be your completely finished work. It's going to take some time, and a good writer always writes a draft, lets it sit just a little bit, comes back to it, refines it, has somebody else look at it, give feedback. Does it make sense? So writing is a process, and it's a process that is analytical. Sometimes when I'm writing, I'm not really sure what I'm going to say exactly until I start writing. So writing is a form of thinking and analysis. And so it's a draft. Just keep in mind that you're trying to balance that it doesn't have to be completely done, but the better your draft is, the less you have to do on the other side of it. So every piece of writing that I have published, I come back to it and I see that it was a benchmark in my learning. And writing is like housework. It can always be improved and more could be done. And so at some point you have to say, well, this is my best effort at this point. Okay, so but you don't have to be there quite yet with these very first drafts. By the time we get to the end of our 7 weeks together, you should have rewritten each section of the paper several times. But this very first draft should be like you're kind of laying out the bare bones of it. Okay, so what are going to be the bare bones in this first introductory context, section 1? Okay, so section 1 of our final project plan is going to be about exemplary teaching in the 21st century and how it plays a role in addressing the historical opportunity gaps toward realizing educational equity. Okay, now that's kind of a mouthful there. Okay, and you're going to be reading about that in our modules and discussing that. So don't, for the first couple modules up to March 26th, we're going to be reading and talking about on our discussion board and in our Zoom meeting together. We're going to be talking about this connection here. So if it doesn't seem totally clear to you yet, that is okay. Just try to not be too anxious so that you don't shut your learning down. You want to have a little bit of anxiety so that you're like fully alert, fully paying attention, but you don't want to be over anxious that your whole cognitive focus and ability to learn is shut down. So you got to kind of hit that fine line there. Okay. So, okay, let's look a little closer. The first section of the final plan project is the rationale for the final piece of work. It uses the readings and text from our class as empirical evidence for the following. Okay, you may use outside resources for sure, but I definitely want to let you know that our course texts are going to be the foundation of what you're working with. I chose these very carefully, knowing that I didn't want you to waste any money or resources or time on something that wasn't hugely valuable. So I do want to see the bulk of the evidence that you use, grounding your points of view and your writing in the literature. And all of these are based on the literature. Okay, so it's not just my opinion, it comes out of generations of well-documented research. Okay, so I'm going to expect those. You can use the readings in the modules as well. And you're certainly welcome to choose other readings that you find elsewhere. I know you're very capable scholars yourself, so be welcome to do that, certainly. It is graduate level writing, so you will already have quite a few references in your bibliography, your reference section, because you're going to be using these and the readings in the modules. But you can bring other pieces in as well. So again, it's graduate work, so you want to be very concise, but you also don't want your reader to be guessing what you're going to say. As I tell my students who are student teachers working on the PPAT, the people who are evaluating their work are not going to take time to try to guess what was in your mind. And that's me too. You need to be concise, but also I'm not going to make inferences about what I think you mean. So if you say something like, exemplary teaching is about student learning and so on. That's way too vague. I don't know what you mean. My idea of that might be different than yours. And so I'm not going to try to guess that. So you have to be concise. So tell me, show me, then the so what piece of academic writing. Okay. So that a page number, I know that's very frustrating for people sometimes, that I don't like to give page numbers. I think I put a pretty good ballpark, but try to focus on the big picture, not the minute details about what this is trying to do and why you're writing it and how it's for you rather than for me. And then I think things like page numbers and number of references, they will come within the bigger picture. Okay. So if I don't see these references, that's already going to be a big problem in your final project. Okay. So what it should be used for the following. A, it focus on defining the topic of exemplary teaching in the 21st century. We've already talked a little bit about that. What makes exemplary teaching exemplary as compared to other forms of teaching, right? The adjective exemplary means that there's an unspoken other part of that. Exemplary and then the non-exemplary. What is that, right? And week 1, we've been exploring that. Week 2, we're going to explore that. Week 3, and really that's a thread that goes all the way through. But in the first couple of weeks, we're really defining what makes exemplary compared to non-exemplary. So you're going to be talking about that. Exemplary teachers are teachers who are successful with learners that other teachers continue to fail with in terms of promoting high levels of positive learning outcomes, experiences, and opportunities. What does that look like? We look at examples of that. Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings has explained that clearly. So what are the three things that she says? That teachers are not cookie cutters. They do not just use the same things. Teaching is an expression of yourself, but they do have and share three main principles. And Dr. Ladson Billings spells those out. Okay. And so that's what makes these exemplary teachers different than the non-exemplary, is because the three are there. Sometimes other teachers might have one or two, but you need the three. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. We're reading more about that. So that's going to be key in this first introduction, and talking about the introduction to exemplary teaching in the 21st century and the context of it. You know, it's not something that just comes out of nowhere. Why do some teachers, why are they exemplary and some teachers are not? Okay, so we're going to define that. What does it look like? How has it been documented in the research? Again, our readings in the module, I did not choose any reading that wasn't research-based or any video that wasn't research-based. So you have plenty of resources for that, and you can use the authors and the researchers that are in the module to go and do further looking on that. Okay. What makes these exemplary teachers different from teachers who continue to fail, with the learners defined as the toughest to teach? They're so-called at risk. At risk for what, right? Okay, B, it gives examples of exemplary teaching in the 21st century, thumbnail sketches of teachers who are exemplary. Now, I provide a thumbnail sketch in one of the modules where I give examples of them. Now, one thing to think about as you look at this A, B, C, D, this is not a checklist. So read it over and think about, you know, be thinking as you're reading the modules and writing your discussion boards and kind of pondering and percolating on what you're learning in the modules. These are just points that I would look for and consider important, but that's not a checklist. Like you're going to say that your first paragraph is going to be A, your second paragraph is B, your third paragraph is C. No, this is not a checklist. It's just an overall vision of what are the components that should be in this introduction. So read them through, get an idea what's in your head, then close that and start writing. Sometimes teachers get very, and I do this too, I get locked up where I've read all of this literature, I've got my head just bursting with information, and then I don't even know what to do. I put my hands on the keyboard and I'm frozen. So that may happen to you too. And the thing that I learned very early on, and one of my colleagues, my fellow, we went to grad school together. He just grabbed the keyboard from me and just started typing any kind of random thing. What my topic was, he started my page, and then I had some words on my page, and I was able to go on from there. So if you have that too, where you're like, wow, this is A, B, C, all the way down to P, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. So read through carefully, think about it, close it, and then just start free writing. Okay, then you can go back and see, did I talk about this? Did I talk about this? Because it is not a checklist. It's not a recipe. So what you have to do is make it your own. And that's what's really helpful about just closed it down. You know in your head, you got A through P in your head. Now close it down and just write. Let go of that. Just write it in your own words, because you know a lot, and your writing voice and your experience and your understandings are going to come through in your writing and on your document. So it's really important that you not look at that as a checklist, but look at it holistically and start writing. As you do your drafts, you can put your headings in. You can check, do I have paragraphs? Do I have a thesis statement? Do I have transitions? One thing that I have to look for, my sentences tend to be super long. I studied carefully. I was so involved in critical pedagogy when it was pretty new. And so like Peter McLaren was just coming out with things, and a lot of the critical theorists, they would write these sentences that were, no joke, a paragraph long. And so that was what I was reading. I was being socialized into that. And so my writing would be like that. And then other people would look at it and they're like, what in the heck does that say? It's the sentence goes on for a paragraph, and I have you lost me like mid third line. And so I've had to unlearn that, and I've had to learn to write in real succinct, brief sentences, and make it as clear as possible. So if that's you, be thinking about that. But your main thing in your first draft is just to get the ideas in. You can go back later and kind of polish it up. Where do I need headings? Where do I need a transition? Okay. So as you write, you need some sort of a hook to get your reader to know right from the beginning, why is this topic of exemplary teaching in the 21st century important? Why should the reader give their valuable time to pay attention to what you wrote and said about this? Okay. And at the same time, you're trying to demonstrate your learning about this. Okay. So does that make sense? And again, this is a draft. A lot of times when I'm writing a manuscript that I'm going to send to a journal to be published, I don't worry too much about my intro until I'm finished with the whole paper. Because as I'm writing, a lot of times, I don't know exactly how I want to say things, or sometimes I'll be writing and suddenly I'll have this big aha moment. And I didn't know about that aha moment until I started writing. It was through the process of writing. And so when I begin a manuscript, I need some sort of a tentative introduction, but I'm not like saying I have to get this right before I can move on, because the best introductions lead to and tell your reader about what's coming up in the paper. And so if I don't necessarily super know what's all coming up in the paper, because writing is thinking and analyzing, and I haven't done that yet, by the time I get to the end of the paper, then I can read it as a whole, and I can go back and fine tune that intro. Do you see what I'm saying? So, don't be overly harsh on yourself so that you're like, got writer's block and you're so anxious that nothing is coming out of your fingers. So just kind of be loose and say, hey, I can always delete that. You can't be like my dissertation chair. He said to me, you cannot be so married to the text that you write. Let it go. So you have to be a little bit loose and flowing, and sometimes you have to free write. You can fine tune it as you keep going back to it. Okay, so it's really a process. So okay, so we talked about here you're kind of defining exemplary teaching, what makes it different, and then so exemplary teaching, and then that 21st century, we've got to talk about that. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment, and you'll be reading and you'll know more about that too. Okay. So C discusses those three principles that all exemplary teachers use. And a lot of times, particularly people who have some background in the Judeo-Christian tradition, they often understand principles pretty well, and they understand how principles work because they have being of various Judeo-Christian backgrounds, they often draw on what they know about the Christian, the Judeo-Christian literature, the Bible. Okay, and so if you are familiar with the Judeo-Christian background traditions, you know that the Bible is divided into various books. You got the Old Testament and the New Testament. And in the Old Testament, it's very step by step. There's all these rules and all of these, like how many steps can you take on the Sabbath and so on. Then you go into the New Testament, and it's more principle based, where there's like these ideals, and then you are supposed to measure your behavior against these ideals, and it doesn't tell you step by step anymore, but you are in charge of measuring yourself against those ideals, and those ideals are principles. So that's why a lot of people who have familiarity with the Judeo-Christian background, they will often pick up real quickly on the three principles of exemplary teaching, because they understand that that these principles work as these kind of ideals where you evaluate what you do, how you interact with your students, the curriculum that you choose, how you assess it, and you're guiding it by these three principles. So these principles act as like a pair of glasses, where that's what you look for, and you're measuring everything. Does it measure up to this? Does it do this? Does it do that? Do you see how that's different from a checklist? It's much broader. It's more like guiding rather than a recipe or a checklist. So think about that. Hopefully that helps, even if you don't have a background in the Judeo-Christian traditions. That's just, I think, a really good example of that. So what are those three traditions, those three principles that Ladson Billings talks about? And we watch a video. So here I even tell you what they are. Here's the first principle. D is the first principle. Exemplary teachers always promote high levels of academic achievement. The second principle that all exemplary teachers do is they promote high levels of cultural competence. Okay. And what that means is that they promote themselves and their own independent learning as being able to walk in both worlds. If I want my students to walk in both worlds and be culturally competent, I have to be able to do that too. So it's just like when you get on the airplane and they tell you, put your own mask on first, because if you don't, you can't help other people. Well, same thing with being culturally competent. You have to develop that in yourself so that you can foster and support that in your students. So we read a short story by an actual teacher, Mr. Frank Finnegar, and he talks about his student Matthew, and he moves from being a teacher who is more ethnocentric and just sees his own knowledge and viewpoints as normal and school knowledge. And then he learns to be culturally competent and bring Matthew's knowledge in too, so that Matthew's knowledge and Matthew can walk in school knowledge. And then he also does not have to strip himself of his own background, like in the butterfly story. Matthew can be Matthew of his own indigenous nation and successful in school. Okay, so you as a teacher have to foster that. And that's what exemplary teachers do, is they foster these high levels of cultural competence. And the third principle is that exemplary teachers, they foster high levels of awareness and competence in assessing and addressing criticality. Okay, and what that means is that teachers are not colorblind, they're not difference blind, they're not gender blind. They know that differences make a difference. So, for example, in the United States, to this day, women, so this is a gender difference, gender being identified as male or female, that has real consequences because women with the same educational background, skills, and experience still will make about 7 cents on the dollar less than men do for the same job with the same background. So it matters what your identity is and what difference it is. Differences make a difference. And that pay gap actually increases if you happen to be a person of color and identified as female as well. So, so teachers are aware of that and they address that. So like for myself, I knew that my students were economic refugees, many of them coming from Central America and from Mexico, which is also part of North America. When people say America, they often are referring to the United States, but that is inaccurate. Canada is part of America. The United States is part of America. Argentina is part of America. Mexico is part of America. So teachers know and understand. I knew that my students were economic refugees coming from Mexico, and I knew that their primary language, and which was often Spanish, although that's not the only language in Mexico, I knew that that would be devalued. I knew that people often, intentionally or not, they often have implicit biases against Latinx students. So I knew that it was my job to ensure that they were accelerated, that they had every opportunity to have high quality educational experiences, opportunities, outcomes, because I was addressing that knowledge that Spanish is devalued in the United States as a language. Okay, so that that knowledge of inequities is key to this third principle. So that principle must be front and center in the introduction. And you see that it's very well addressed in this book here. They even define it, defining trauma-informed education. What is equity? So defining equity, let me see what's in the table of contents here. Okay, so they define trauma, define equity, and again, they talk about it, how it's not a checklist, but a way of looking at the world and how that impacts. So this book here is fundamentally about how teachers address this principle here. So that third principle is super critical, and all of the exemplary teachers address that. It's also the toughest principle to be able to understand. It's the toughest one to be able to enact and write about. So, but just because it's tough doesn't mean that we can't do it. You can. If I can, you certainly can. Okay. And this book also has examples of teachers addressing all three of those: high levels of academic achievement, high levels of cultural competence, and then high levels of criticality. Okay, so students should be able to look around the world or their world and use their education to be able to assess what's going on and how to act on it in ways that makes our world a better place. My own third graders were very aware that the park down the road from our school, where we often did our physical education, they were aware, and we worked very hard to ensure that they did not ever pick up any needles or were not cut by broken glass bottles. And we wanted to know, why does the park closest to our school, why do we have such those kinds of things in a public space in our community? And they wanted to know about, why were there so many liquor stores in our community? So they were aware of what was going on, and they were able to assess that and think about it. And then and it's amazing what even 8- and 9-year-olds can do, writing letters or thinking about how to address it. So there's many things. We did lots of work. This was quite some time ago, before you heard a lot about global warming and climate change. We did a lot of things on recycling and garbage, because we had a lot of litter in our neighborhood. And so we linked that to lots of science knowledge, lots of math knowledge, lots of social skills knowledge. And we needed a lot of literacy skills to be able to do those things. We had a lot of guest speakers come in. So there's many ways that you can address what is happening around you and make your classroom meaningful in ways that exemplary teachers do. Okay, so all right, so moving on, let's see. So I've talked about this book here with trauma. Okay, so I guess the main thing that we have here for G and H would be the part here about addressing exemplary teaching in the 21st century. How does that address historical opportunity gaps toward educational equity? Okay, so what that means, and you will get a lot from this book here, as far as, a lot of people will talk about ACEs, and they'll talk about trauma in communities, and that's certainly true. I had a student, I was visiting a school, and a teacher was explaining to me that the children in that school came from tough homes, and there was a lot of crime, and in many of the families there, the dads were incarcerated, and sometimes the moms, and so grandparents would be raising children, and sometimes even uncles were in prison as well. And so this one little guy was in this fifth grade classroom, and the teacher was talking to me in a low voice, and so the child didn't hear it, but was pointing him out and said, his grandpa's in jail, his uncle's in jail, his cousin's in jail. I mean, this kid is headed for jail. But what I said was, well, but he's not in jail now, right? And so, your job is to teach him. Isn't that the whole point of education, that education is the way? And so, he's right here. He's not in jail. Now is the time to be teaching him and working with him and building his confidence and skills and knowledge, high levels of academic achievement, how to walk in both worlds. You can be you and successful in school. Sometimes, like with me coming from Alabama, if sometimes Black students would think that if the other Black students were talking, quote, too white, they would ostracize that student. But it's like, why would you think that being white means academic success, and if you still want to be Black, then you can't be academically successful? Well, historically, that's not true, right? So with this high levels of awareness and addressing criticality, you would want the students to see and know that, for example, Washington, D.C. and the Capitol building were built by the labor of enslaved peoples. So there is tons and tons of things that that are rooted in Black culture. In fact, the art and music that makes art and music uniquely from the United States is actually that Black impulse that is threaded into it. So rock and roll, Elvis Presley's work or career was deeply indebted to jazz and Black musicians and so on. So to have academic success associated only with white people is a problem. So as a teacher, then you're addressing that, how Black contributions have been historically marginalized and excluded from the curriculum. It's Women's History Month. You would talk about that we need Women's History Month because women are generally not included in our stories about what our nation has done and the role of women in the world, right? So just going back to my example, that was a teacher who had a deficit lens of this child and had already given up on that child. So I told her, he's not in prison now, he's right here. So this is teaching time. You only have them and you can only control what is in your sphere of influence. So the moment that they come through the door, that is your sphere of influence and your job is to teach them. And so you might disagree with the parents, you might have a negative viewpoint of them, maybe the parents' sexuality, maybe the parents are selling crack, whatever. And so you only have control over what is in your sphere of influence. So you put it in your back pocket, what you think about their sexuality. Maybe it's two moms. Maybe you feel like that neighborhood has a little bit too much partying going on or whatever. You put that in your back pocket because you're not in charge of them. You're in charge of your classroom and the teaching in your classroom. And so, yes, there are issues that you're going to be aware of, like maybe the electricity has been turned off, but so they bring that to school as they come in, but that is no excuse to stop teaching and foster high levels of academic achievement, high levels of cultural competence, and being aware of that. That child maybe didn't have electricity last night, but he's still got to be functioning in class. And that's what exemplary teachers do. So they control what's in their classroom. The trauma that is outside is important, of course, but you may not have control over that. And you certainly don't have any control over the teachers. But students are often deeply traumatized by the curriculum, by their teachers' attitudes. From the butterfly story that the teachers often unknowingly inflict trauma in the classroom on their students. So that's our sphere of influence, and we are addressing that trauma in that third principle there, that schools historically have been trauma-filled for learners, that they are pushed out of school because it is so unwelcoming and aggressive toward them that they are pushed out of school. So that's trauma that is school-based and school-created and school-implemented. And teachers and stakeholders in schools, often unwittingly, they perpetuate that. And the reason that I know that is because if you look at the history of public schooling, that public schools have never served all groups of learners equally well. That the more a group is minoritized, the less likely that they have had opportunities in schools. If they come from a background where it's economically challenged and they're facing poverty, schools have not served them well. If they are facing discrimination based on gender or sexuality, that a lot of times, especially with sexuality, you see rates of suicide are very high. So uh, issues of race as well, that's coupled with being pushed out of school. So our educational pipeline, if you think back to Horace Mann and Thomas Jefferson, that a whole idea was that public schooling was going to be the great equalizer, and that no matter what your background was, if you came to the public school, you would have an equal opportunity to be able to excel in your life and have the skills you needed to fully participate in society. Unfortunately, public schools have never done that. And so, uh, so our public schools have been an educational pipeline that is leaking. And so we lose Latinx students in huge numbers. They start out in kindergarten, and by the time you get to high school, you've lost a lot of learners. And then when you get into the first years of college, that number of Latinx students is really down. And so we know that public schools have been focused on providing educational equity, but it hasn't happened. Okay, so exemplary teachers, they break that cycle of the leaking educational pipeline, and they use their teaching to foster educational equity, even for the students that have historically been underserved. Okay, so that's the link, is that exemplary teaching is geared toward actually realizing the public in public education. Public schools are supposed to provide educational equity, but there's all these disparities and the pipeline is leaking. So educational equity is supposed to be fostered by exemplary teaching. So if that's been our goal since public schools were developed as part of the common school movement, and they never have done that, that means we need a different kind of teaching, right? And so if we think about what is in the 21st century, then I'm trying to see if I can bring that 21st century thing up. How is the 21st century different from the 20th century and the 19th century? You have to look at that history of public schooling and how it developed over time. So when Horace Mann and Thomas Jefferson were thinking about this republic that was this great experiment of the United States, they were in a time where if you were you were part of a land owning family, those were the people that could vote. If you were a man and a white man and a landowner, then you could vote. And so like Thomas Jefferson he got his higher education there in Virginia, and his great masterpiece that he wanted to be remembered by was not because he was the third president of the United States. He wanted to be remembered because of his prize accomplishment was the University of Virginia. He loved education, loved learning. He would collect specimens of animals. He was, a scientist, author, all these things. And yet his own daughters could not attend the University of Virginia. His grandsons could, but not his granddaughters or his daughters. So his daughters had been tutored and had an education in France. That's just for girls. They learned things like dancing, drawing, music, so that they could get a husband. But that kind of education that men were getting, boys were getting, was only if you had land and you were white. So the common schooling movement came about then because the idea was, if you were in a republic, then the public should be able to participate. But if only some of the residents and the citizens have access to an education to be able to make informed decisions and use their rationale and thinking, then they should we got to level the playing field, right? And so they were like, well, we'll give them 3 years of public education. And that was the beginning of the common school movement. And so Horace Mann got behind it. A lot of people were against it. But this idea was that you could come even if you weren't a landowner. And of course, we're only talking about white males yet. So as it develops into this idea of the public school, the United States is shifting from an agrarian society where we're mostly farmers to we're beginning to industrialize. And of course, we had the Louisiana Purchase. We're moving westward. We have the war with Mexico, and we annex a whole part of northern Mexico, which includes Utah. So we now are coast to coast, and we're industrializing, and you have people coming from off the farms to work into factories. And in the factories, you have this batch processing. So public schools follow that model where you get all these kids into the classrooms and you're going to batch process them. Okay. And so now you got women who are fighting to get an education and wanting to be in there too. And all these different groups are trying to get in. So it takes quite a while if you are considered so-called your body and your mind, you're considered, quote, disabled from normative standards. Like if your the eardrums don't process sound waves like other people's, you would be considered disabled, and so you could not come. So parents and communities and stakeholders work hard, and thus you see the entrance of special education. And so different groups are working hard to get be welcomed into public schools. The Lemon Grove incident is about 25 years, maybe 30 years before the Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, where it was supposed to be desegregating schools, and it couldn't be racially based anymore, where they were keeping Black kids over there. And with the Lemon Grove incident in California, they were segregating students based on primary language. If you were a Spanish speaker, you could not go to school. And so the Lemon Grove incident was where these primary Spanish speaking families in the Lemon Grove, California, they sued and were successful, and you could no longer keep them out. And interestingly enough, those Latinx students were used for the Brown decision to say, well, look, we are integrating, because Latinx students are seen as racially white. So and that was one bumper that a lot of schools and school districts and communities were doing to keep the Black children out. And so you have all this jockeying over time for groups that have been kept out and have not been served well. Okay, so that's like the 17th century. Very few people get any kind of learning unless you were wealthy enough to have a tutor. And then you get into the 17th and 18th century and the 19th century. And so in the 20th century, with the 21st century now, we're in kind of this knowledge-based society. And so it's much different from our factory-based society. And so we have a different set of skills that are needed to be able to function in this knowledge-based economy. So some of those skills that for the 21st century, which makes it different from the 20th, and the 19th and 18th and 17th century, well, you need to know about global awareness. for example, in Thomas Jefferson's time, the United States was just this fledgling little country, just trying to develop as this little experiment. And so it had this big ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, which separated it from Great Britain and then from France and the rest of Europe. And that was a bumper that cushioned the United States and gave them some time to develop, because you didn't yet have airplanes, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have a quick way of crossing that ocean. And hence, the United States was kind of able to cushion itself and develop its own things without being interfered with these older societies that have been around for centuries. And the United States was able to kind of do its own thing over here. And so in the 21st century, though, you just think about how the United States, we are very connected to China economically, with our imports, exports, the money exchanges, things like that. Today, we have to be globally aware because we're all connected. Our economies are connected. The COVID-19 pandemic shows how deeply connected we are globally. So what's happening in the United States is very much influenced by what's happening in other parts of the world and vice versa. So we have to have global awareness. We have to have environmental literacy. All these sort of things were not necessarily so fundamental in the other centuries, as they have come to the fore and are just in the face of the rising generations with these huge storms and these mega storms and things. This is things that have, the once in a century storms are now happening like every winter, right? And so so the learners, the rising generations, have to be aware of that. And they have to know, for example, the knowledge base. When in the earlier centuries, it was very concrete. It was, this was the knowledge, the mathematics knowledge base, and it changed, but very slowly and very gradually. And now, in today, where we are connected by the internet and we're in a knowledge-based economy, the knowledge base is switching over so quickly that what students are, the careers that will exist when learners today are starting kindergarten, don't exist now, but they will when these learners graduate from high school. So it's changing over that quickly. So that requires a different set of skills than it did when we had these factories that were batch processing students. We have to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of adaptability. We have to be able to work with different groups of people, so we have a lot of things that are very different in the 21st century as compared to the 20th and the 19th century. So you have to talk about those kind of things. And these briefs in this are in your they are in your modules. So that is kind of this one is the biggest section of the paper, and it's going to be obviously much more than a paragraph. You should, write it so that you hook your reader, and then you have a reader's map in there where you're like telling the reader what's going to be coming up in the following paragraphs. And those will be the other sections as well. You should use headings and subheadings. You definitely want a thesis statement in the early part. And again, you can revise that. You can go back to that. You should definitely have a statement of significance. Why is this important? and transitions, again, paragraphs, those are going to be important. So this one is really the setting the stage, and it's going to be pretty big. It'll be probably the biggest section of the paper. Okay. But that is an overview of what it's going to be. And then the readings that are in these first modules, those are the ones that will support you and help you to be able to comprehend and then analyze and apply that, to be able to talk about exemplary teaching as compared to non-exemplary teaching in the 21st century as compared to in the 20th, 19th, 18th century. And then how is that exemplary teaching in the 21st century? How does it function? How is it expected to function to address these historical inequities and opportunity gaps, to promote the actual purpose of education? Public education is to foster the full inclusion and development of every citizen, right? So how does exemplary teaching in the 21st century foster that? Okay, and I will make a video about section 2 as well. But again, please don't be nervous about it. It just has to be a draft, and then you can keep on reworking it. And then once all of the sections 1, 2, and 3 are together, then you'll put them all into one whole as a draft, and then submit your final one. So do not think that your drafts have to be perfect. They should be a work in progress, and you decide how much of a work in progress. Of course, it's going to be harder for you and harder for me to give you feedback if you put the heavier amount of work later rather than sooner, because 7 weeks flies by so quickly. And you're certainly welcome to submit them earlier rather than wait to the day that they have to be in. I will turn them around to you just as quickly as I can. Okay, so this is going to be fun, and I look forward to everything that you're going to be working on and have to share with us.